We begin this hour with mounting tension with Iran. Congress this week has announced more sanctions on the country. This time, they're aimed at companies that ship goods to Iran. And all this is happening as questions remain over whether existing sanctions are working. Even Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has said the sanctions are not stopping Iran from pursuing nuclear ambitions. So what can these new sanctions really achieve? To discuss this is Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the National Iranian American Council. Jamal, welcome to the show. So Congress last year, they announced these sanctions that would target financial institutions that do business with Iran. Now they're expanding these sanctions. What do these new limits really do?
The new sanctions are really just a continuation of the old sanctions. Effectively, they're tightening the screws on some of the sanctions that are already in place. They're closing certain loopholes, so-called loopholes. They're imposing new sanctions on companies that insure ships that transport Iranian oil. There are some so-called human rights measures in here that really fall flat and are not actually supportive of human rights in Iran. But basically what this bill does is it just advances what already is the case, which is that we have this, what is becoming an economic embargo on Iran. We don't ship anything to Iran, but we also prevent other countries from shipping items to Iran or buying oil from Iran. And so this is just becoming a bigger and bigger embargo that we're putting on.
And you had mentioned the human rights violations. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, Congress passed targeted human rights sanctions against Iranian regime officials who were guilty of human rights abuses. They did this a couple years ago. The Obama administration has put sanctions on these officials, their financial restrictions, their travel restrictions. And frankly, I think that this is the type of sanction that actually is beneficial to actually target the folks who are behind some of the abuses. But in this new bill, they're basically doubling down on that, and this is a kind of a small piecemeal part of the bill, whereas the majority of what the bill does is actually impose these restrictions that are blocking medicine from getting into Iran, that are blocking food and humanitarian products from getting into Iran, that are isolating Iranian students who want to study abroad. And so when you actually add them all up, the human rights measures fall pretty short, and it's sort of a joke to say that this is advancing human rights when you're punishing people on a humanitarian level like this.
And despite that, there are some lawmakers that say that these sanctions, the existing ones, they don't go far enough. What do you make of that?
Yeah, really what the aim was for a lot of folks who supported this was to flip the switch on economic warfare. I think what we have in place it constitutes economic warfare, and it dovetails nicely with the cyber warfare and the covert warfare that we are now engaged in with Iran. But what they wanted this bill to do was to actually sanction every single financial entity inside of Iran to make it legally impossible to send any goods to Iran or for Iran to send anything out. What we already have, though, is that in effect, it's impossible to send items to Iran. For instance, there are food producers here in the U.S. who they can't find a way to actually sell their goods in Iran, even though the sanctions technically exempt food products, because we have this ambiguity and banks are unwilling to facilitate these transactions. So really, it would make law what is already in effect and which is being called economic warfare, which I think is really what precedes military warfare.
I do want to bring this up, something that U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, this is what he had to say about sanctions. He says, quote, what we all need to do is to continue the pressure on Iran economically and diplomatically to negotiate and to ultimately do what's right in joining the international family. So, I mean, sanctions, is that the way to achieve this?
Look, the Secretary, he says that sanctions aren't working in the same breath that he says we need more sanctions. I think everybody in Washington understands that we're not going to get to a solution to this problem by just imposing more and more sanctions. I don't think there's really honestly anybody who thinks that this is the trajectory to a diplomatic resolution with Iran. What they acknowledge, I think, for a lot of these folks, is that we are now in a position where policymakers are being asked to decide, do you want economic warfare or military warfare? And so the folks who actually do support a diplomatic solution are choosing between these two bad options. And then you have folks who, like the Defense Secretary, really are protecting the president, who has invested a lot of time in these sanctions and doesn't have a whole lot to show for it other than the serious humanitarian crisis that's emerging inside of Iran.
Now, I know a lot of people consider sanctions an act of war. And could that be what this is? Could these ramped up sanctions be a last-ditch effort before military intervention?
They really could be. What is happening now is that the Obama administration doesn't want to see military action on Iran. They don't want to see Israel go in there. They don't want to have to, green light strikes on their own. But we're in a situation where until November, it's going to be impossible to actually do anything that is perceived as looking weak on Iran, even if, it's a matter of getting real Iranian concessions. If it involves waiving the sanctions, Romney, Congress, they're going to attack the president as being weak. And so really what they're trying to do is slow this process down so that they can get through the end of the election and then have the maneuverability, hopefully, to actually negotiate, to actually leverage these sanctions. And so what we're seeing is this slow drip of every 2 weeks they announce new sanctions. And Congress, they pass a sanctions bill before they go home. And everybody appears to be doing something that is tough, but really is designed to buy time. And the hope is that in buying time, we're not actually making it more likely that a military strike happens in the next few months.
So you're saying that this all could be just for show in this election season?
Well, right now, everybody's thinking about their campaign. Everybody's looking to go home and campaign off of the sanctions bill, to campaign on how tough they are on Iran. I think President Obama is looking to appear tough in terms of the sanctions he's passed. And he's really, compared to what the Romney campaign is saying, they're engaging in this sort of rhetorical battle, but articulating the exact same policies. At the end of the day, nobody's actually talking about any approaches that we haven't already tried, that haven't already basically failed, and the types of tough decisions that need to be made about, do we want to find a diplomatic solution, or do we want to continue down this road to inevitable confrontation?
And I mean, in your opinion, how would you contrast the stance, President Obama's stance, and Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney's stance in terms of their approach to handling Iran?
I think that the Obama administration has been more willing to talk about the diplomatic track. I don't think that there's actually substantively that much different, although I would look to some of the advisors in the Romney camp, folks who have supported terrorist groups like the MEK, folks like John Bolton who have advocated openly for bombing Iran. And the real question is, what happens when Mitt Romney takes office? Is there going to be a greater focus on the military option? And, I think it's an open question right now in Washington. Do folks actually see sanctions and the U.S. policy towards Iran as one of regime change, or one intended to bring Iran to the table for a diplomatic solution? I think that there are folks in both camps who actually think that we can impose so many sanctions on the Iranian people that somehow they're going to be compelled to rise up against the regime, even as you have human rights defenders and democracy defenders on the ground in Iran saying, look, these sanctions are undermining us. They're punishing the core of our movement. Here in Washington, it's attracted to some people that sanctions can actually harm people to the extent that regime change is suddenly on the table.
And lastly, I want to ask you, if not sanctions, what other routes can lawmakers go?
Well, lawmakers, frankly, should give the president the political support for diplomacy and the legal support for diplomacy. Instead of passing bills that make it harder to waive sanctions in exchange for Iranian concessions, pass a measure that actually gives the president the flexibility to do that and encourages him to do what is actually in the U.S.'s best interest and the international community's best interest. That's not what they're doing now. And they're also, in the meantime, they can take some measures, if they really support human rights in Iran, take some measures to actually exempt food and medicine from the sanctions, make sure that these aren't being blocked, make sure that internet communication tools aren't blocked by the sanctions. But in the world of campaign politics, that's not what sells at fundraisers, and so Congress isn't doing that.
Certainly, these sanctions are affecting a lot more people than the intended effect there. But Jamal, very interesting. Thanks so much for coming on the show. That was Jamal Abdi. He is the policy director for the National Iranian American Council.